Are you mocking me? Do not be mocking me.
Just Picasso draws like all.
It's because Picasso
This
does a lot
is
of absence.
realism. It's not abstract, okay?
Right.
So, don't you be.
Picasso is actually Cubist, just to
Yeah.
just keep it real. It's true. He's a
It's
Cubist.
still a form of abstraction. It's not realism, right? This is the muscle spindle organ. So this is a muscle. These are called extrafusal fibers. This is the muscle spindle. It is the proprioceptor for stretch. Within here we have different kind of fibers. Maybe yellow intrafusal fibers. Okay. So this is the muscle spindle organs, and this is intrafusal fibers. These are extrafusal fibers. The extrafusal fibers are responsible for making the muscle actually contract. The intrafusal fibers are part of this muscle spindle, and they adjust the tension so that at different positions the muscle spindle is more or less sensitive. So we have intrafusal fibers and extrafusal fibers, right?
Yeah.
All skeletal muscles have these muscle spindle organs that detect stretch in the muscle. Okay. So the muscle spindle consists of intrafusal fibers and then sensory neurons. There's some on this side too, but I'm just going to draw it on here. Okay? This has the same thing, but I'm only going to draw one side. There is two types of sensory neurons. There's one that goes in the middle. We call these the type 1A sensory neuron. And then there's some that goes at the ends. See, wraps around the end here, wraps around the end here. The ones that wrap around the end is called type 2. So type 1A, should I make it Roman numeral? 1A, and then type 2. Okay? Now, there are 6 steps to a reflex arc. The first step is something called a stimulus. So the arc that what I'm going to draw is something called a classic stretch reflex. Okay? In a classic stretch reflex, something happens to stretch a muscle. So what could happen is something like, you have a mallet or a hammer, and you hit here, and when you hit here, like your knee, it causes this muscle to stretch, right? If I hit this tendon, won't this stretch?
Yes.
And when it stretches, what do? It responds by contracting. If this contracts and gets shorter, it'll make this kick out.
Yeah, right.
That's your knee jerk or your patellar tendon reflex. The patellar tendon reflex is an example of this classic stretch reflex. In a classic stretch reflex, you stretch a muscle, it responds by contracting. Okay? So the first step is the stimulus. So number 1, stimulus. And what was the stimulus?
The mallet.
Nope.
The stretch.
Muscle stretch. The mallet is what caused the muscle stretch, but if I were to hold the tendon still and I hit with a mallet, it won't cause the effect. It's really the stretch of the muscle. The mallet is just what's causing this to stretch. And I don't need a mallet, I can do it with my hand or anything else. What I need is to stretch the muscle.
Right.
If I were to hold this and then hit with the mallet so it doesn't stretch, it will not do this. So what actually caused the actual stimulus is this, muscle stretching. And of course, when you hit this, it causes this stretch, which is the stimulus.
Right.
Okay? So in the classic stretch reflex, the stimulus, what triggers it, is a
Muscle
stretch
stretch.
of a muscle. And the hammer is just what we use to make it stretch.
Right.
Right, the mallet? Okay. So we have 2 types of these sensory neurons. And the sensory neurons, the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located where? The dorsal root ganglion. Cell bodies. Right? So if this was
Of the sensory.
these are sensory. The
Right.
job
Motor
of,
are in the anterior root, correct? Ganglion.
no, there is no anterior. There's the dorsal root
Or
ganglion,
the ventral.
and there's the ventral root, which is
Ventral
where the
root.
motors are located.
Right, motors
Right.
are located, yeah.
So we have, that. Then we have that's the spinal cord, right?
Right.
Okay. Let's look a little better. A little bit better, not much. Okay. Now, okay, so I think the first time I didn't draw the type 2 because the type 2 does something else. But there are two parts. So step 1 is the stimulus. Step 2 is what receives the stimulus or what can detect it, which is the
Receptor.
receptor. What is the receptor in this reflex?
The muscle, the tendon.
No, the spindle.
The muscle spindle organ. That's this structure here. That's what's detecting the stretch. When I hit this, it stretches, but how do I know it stretched? Because of this. When this stretched, it made these deform. Okay, and now, number 3 is the sensory neuron. You don't actually have to draw the type 2. I just drew it because my physiology students are doing this too for their next test, which is also next week. And they don't have to draw it, but they have to describe not only the type 1A, but the type 2. They have to describe all 3 arcs. You guys just have to draw 1 arc. So you don't really have to draw the type 2 arc, so you can kind of ignore that. But just so you know, for physiology, there is a type 1A and a type 2. So you can basically ignore that. I'm going to draw just with the type 1A. Okay? But there is a type 2, and that does something else, and don't worry about it. Okay? Which you'll learn about in physio.
Yay, January 2nd.
Yeah? I know, it's so far for you, huh? All right. Anyway, so the sensory neuron's job is to take the information that was received by the receptor, in this case, muscle stretch, change it into an electrical signal, and pass it along to the CNS. Okay. So then the next one is this. Okay. So this is the motor neuron. This is the ventral horn that you were talking about. So number 4 is something called the center. And number 5 is something called the motor neuron. In this particular reflex, I'm drawing this first arc. These 2 things are actually the same. It's this cell. This cell, the center is the part of the central nervous system that receives the sensory information. What's receiving the sensory information? This cell. Sensory information is coming from here and it's delivering it to this.
Yes.
So that's the center. The job of the motor neuron is to take information from the center or the CNS out of the CNS. What's doing that? This same cell. So this cell is acting as the center and also the motor neuron. And it is delivering it to step number 6.
Is that the effector?
That's the effector. The effector is what causes the action. Now the effector is these brown fibers here, because the brown fibers actually contract, and when this contracts, this gets shorter and makes you kick. So the effector would be these things here called the extrafusal muscle fibers. So this 1 through 6 is an example of a reflex arc. This reflex arc happens to be what's called a monosynaptic reflex arc. Why is it monosynaptic? Because there's only one connection in the what?
CNS.
CNS. You go straight from sensory directly to motor. But we do have another arc here that I will draw that goes maybe this.
You know, you can erase the red one.
I can erase the
Oh
blue
yeah,
one.
the one we're not using.
You want me to erase the blue one?
Yeah.
you don't want the blue one. But there is something called type 2, but
Physio.
physio. All right, so just so you know, there is something called type 2, which you don't need to worry about this time. Okay?
I needed that for physio.
But yes, that's called the gamma motor neuron arc. What I just drew is something called the alpha motor neuron arc. And now I'm going to draw something called the reciprocal alpha motor neuron arc. So those words will become important to you in physio.
Great.
And right now you're like, I don't know what that means. Okay. So notice that I have one loop that starts here and goes to here, right? That's one reflex arc. That's called the alpha motor neuron arc. But I have another one that starts here and goes to here. That's called the reciprocal alpha motor neuron arc. This one is not monosynaptic. The first one was monosynaptic. This one is polysynaptic because I have 2 levels of connection in the CNS.
Does that go from a sensory to an interneuron to a motor neuron?
Correct.
Bam!
Goes from sensory. So let me show you. So number 1 is still the same, stimulus. Number 2 is still the same, receptor. Number 3 is still the same,
Sensory neuron.
sensory
4 and 5 change.
neuron. 4 and 5 are going to change. Number 4, the center, is this cell here. Number 5, the motor neuron, is which cell?
The one under it.
Is that cell right there. And where's number 6? And number 6, the effector, would be that right there. Right, where this is going to. So we drew 2 arcs. It's called an arc because you go to the CNS and back, like an archway. So we have 2 reflex arcs. We have one called the alpha motor neuron arc, which goes here. And we have which is monosynaptic. And then we have a polysynaptic arc called the reciprocal alpha motor neuron arc, which starts here and goes all the way to the opposite side. The job of the first arc, the blue one, is to contract the muscle that you've stretched.
Yeah.
The job of the reciprocal, the light green arch, is to inhibit the opposite muscle. So that when I do this, I actually cause this to stretch. And I don't want this stretch, this contraction and this stretch to cause it to do this, which means that we'll keep on going back and forth forever. Okay? So, so I may ask you on the test either to draw a monosynaptic arc or a poly. If I say monosynaptic, draw the blue one. If I say poly, you draw the green one. You don't have to draw both. I just drew both because I could ask you to draw one or the other. Okay? If I ask you to draw a polysynaptic, which one would you draw?
The green.
The green. If I say monosynaptic, what are you going to draw?
The red. Or the blue.
The blue one, right? Right? What I mean by blue is 1 through 6 in blue versus 1 through 6 in
Green.
green.
It's just the terms that were.
Monosynaptic blue, polysynaptic green.
Correct. The green pathway versus
Yeah, I was
the blue.
following the red.
I know, I was like, wait.
Well,
Yeah.
it starts with red, but
And
we
then,
both
yeah,
have
it turns
red.
into, yeah, that's what I was looking at.
So, but I was talking about the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because
Okay.
that's the reflex.
It's just the last 3 that change.
Okay.
We just have
first
to
three
write
are
the
same
terms.
as well.
Yeah.
We just have to write the terms, like nothing like a description of each term.
No, you just have to draw this. Actually,
Okay.
all you have to do is 1 through 6. You don't have to tell me that this is called a muscle spindle or
Got it.
extrafusal. The reason I'm mentioning that is in physio, you have